She showed up at his door with nothing but a letter and bruises she was trying to hide, and he was the last man on earth anyone expected to let her in. Deep in the Bitterroot Mountains, where winter doesn't ask permission and the cold kills without apology, a woman nobody wanted climbed an icy trail in the dark to find a man who never sent for her. Ronan Mercer had spent 4 years becoming someone the world forgot, and he preferred it that way. Delilah Boone had spent her entire life being told she was too much and not enough at the same time. When fate dropped her on his doorstep, neither of them was ready for what came next. This is a story about two broken people, one impossible winter, and the kind of courage that doesn't look like courage until you're standing in the middle of it. If this story moves you, drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this mountain reaches. And if you haven't subscribed yet, join our family so you never miss the stories that hit hardest. Now, let's go back to that mountain. The trail up to Ronan Mercer's cabin didn't have a name on any map, and that was intentional. It wound through a narrow cut in the rock face, about 2 miles east of the nearest trailhead, then climbed another 700 feet through dense lodgepole pine before leveling off at a small clearing where the cabin sat with its back against a granite outcropping like it was trying to disappear into the stone. Most people who stumbled onto the lower part of the trail in summer assumed it led nowhere and turned around. In winter, nobody came at all. The snow packed so deep between the trees that the path became indistinguishable from the rest of the mountainside, and the temperature dropped so fast after dark that even experienced men didn't test it without a strong reason. Ronan had chosen this place for exactly that quality. It punished the uncommitted. He was splitting wood behind the cabin when he heard something wrong. Not dangerous wrong. Not the crack of a branch that meant elk or the low warning sound a mountain lion sometimes made before it decided whether you were worth the trouble. This was different. Slower. Uneven. The sound of something struggling up the last grade before the clearing, something that had no business being on that trail at this hour, with the sun already behind the western peaks and the temperature falling hard. He set the axe down without making a sound and moved around the side of the cabin. His hand found the rifle leaning against the wall by habit, not urgency. He didn't raise it. What he saw stopped him cold. A woman was making her way out of the tree line. She was moving slow. Not because she was being cautious, but because she was spent. Each step looked like a negotiation between her body and the snow, which came up past her ankles even along the clearest part of the trail. She was carrying a bag over one shoulder, a battered thing that looked like it had been repaired more than once, and she had both arms wrapped around herself against the cold. Her coat was wool, but not heavy enough for this elevation in January. Her boots were decent, but not right for deep snow. Her breath came in short, visible bursts, and even from across the clearing, Ronan could see that her face was red from cold and exertion and something that might have been pure, furious determination. She was a big woman, not the way that word sometimes got used to mean tall. She was full-figured, wide through the hips and shoulders, carrying weight that most men in this part of the country would have considered worth a remark. The kind of build that got noticed whether a woman wanted to be noticed or not. She looked maybe 23, 24. Young. Too young to be on a mountain alone after dark. She stopped when she saw him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she squared her shoulders, actually squared them, like she was walking into a fight she'd already decided to finish, and crossed the rest of the clearing toward him. "Are you Ronan Mercer?" she asked. Her voice came out steady, which surprised him. Most people who arrived at his cabin that tired and that cold were already apologizing before they got a word out. "Depends on who's asking," he said. Not unfriendly, just honest. "My name is Delilah Boone." She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, extending it toward him. Her hand was shaking, but he thought that was probably the cold more than nerves. "I have a letter." He took it. Read it once, then read it again, because the first time through he was certain he'd misunderstood something. The letter was from a matrimonial agency in Billings called Westward Hearts. It confirmed the arrangement between one Ronan Mercer of the Bitterroot Range and one Delilah Ann Boone of Cheyenne, Wyoming. It listed a date of correspondence, a fee paid, a mutual agreement to meet with the intention of lawful marriage. It was signed by someone named Margaret Holloway, proprietress, and it had his name on it clear as anything. Ronan had never written to any matrimonial agency in his life. "There's been a mistake," he said flatly. Something moved across her face. Not surprise, exactly. More like confirmation, like she'd been braced for this since before she started climbing. What kind of mistake? She asked. I didn't send for a bride. He handed the letter back. I don't know who told this agency I did, but it wasn't me. She looked at him for a long moment. Her jaw was set tight, and there were dark circles under her eyes that didn't come from one bad night's sleep. She took the letter back and folded it carefully, like it was something she'd already decided to keep regardless. I see, she said. Town's back down the mountain, 2 miles to the trailhead, another 6 after that to Harlan's Creek. You can get a room at the Callaway boarding house if you— It's full dark, she said. Not arguing, just stating. He looked at the sky. She was right. The light had dropped while he was reading, and the temperature had gone with it. The trail she'd just climbed was nothing you wanted to negotiate in the dark in January, even if you were fresh. She was anything but fresh. He stood there for a moment with the letter in her hand and the cold coming down hard, and the pine trees pressing in from every side, and he thought about saying what he'd been about to say, which was that she could shelter in the woodshed until first light. Then he saw her shift the bag on her shoulder, and her coat sleeve rode up 1/2 inch, and he caught it. A bruise on her wrist. Yellowish green at the edges, which meant it was old but dark at the center, which meant there was something newer underneath. The shape of it wasn't from a fall or a door frame. He recognized the shape. He'd seen that shape before, on his mother's arms a long time ago. He didn't say anything about it. He just stepped aside and opened the cabin door. She looked at the open doorway, then at him, trying to read what the invitation cost, or what it meant, or what he expected in return. You'll freeze before you make the tree line, he said. Nothing more than that. She came in. The inside of the cabin was not what she'd been picturing during the last mile of that climb, when she'd been alternating between imagining a warm fire and imagining being turned away at the door and having to figure out where to sleep in the snow. It was small. One main room that served as everything, sleeping, cooking, sitting, with a loft above that she could see was stacked with supply crates and bundled furs. The fireplace took up most of one wall and was doing its job well. The warmth hit her the moment she stepped inside, and her whole body let go of something it had been holding since mid-afternoon. There was a table with 2 mismatched chairs, a shelf of tools and jars, a rifle rack by the door, a washstand with a cracked ceramic basin. The floor was bare wood, worn smooth from years of use. Everything was functional. Nothing was decorative. She noticed there wasn't a single thing in the room that suggested a woman had ever lived here or been expected here. Ronan closed the door behind her and moved to the fireplace without a word, adding wood from the pile stacked against the wall. He pulled the other chair out from the table and set it closer to the fire. Sit, he said. She sat. The heat from the fire reached her face immediately, and she had to work to keep her expression neutral because the relief of it was almost embarrassing. He filled a pot from the water bucket near the door and hung it over the fire. Then he dug out a tin cup and set it on the table near her. It'll be hot in a few minutes, he said. Thank you. She looked around the room again, taking stock the way she always did when she entered a new space. Exits, windows, sight lines, what was where. Old habit. She'd developed it after the first time she woke up somewhere unfamiliar and had to leave faster than she'd planned. Ronan sat in the chair on the other side of the fire and looked at her directly for the first time. He was a hard-looking man. Not cruel. She'd gotten good at telling the difference, but weathered in the way that men got when they'd been alone a long time and had stopped bothering to look like anything in particular. He was probably mid-30s, though it was hard to say for certain. Dark hair that needed cutting, a beard that had passed the point of being groomed and was now just what his face looked like. His hands were large and scarred across the knuckles. His eyes were gray, the specific gray of river ice, and they watched her with an attention that wasn't predatory so much as careful, like a man who'd learned to read situations before he committed to them. How'd you get up here? He asked. Hired a man from town to bring me as far as the trailhead. He said he didn't go higher than that. Smart man. Apparently not everyone agrees, she said. His mouth shifted, not quite a smile, but something in that direction, and she filed it away. You came up that trail alone in January, he said. Why? She looked at her hands. They were still red from the cold, the skin dry and cracked at the knuckles. She had big hands. She'd heard about them most of her life, the way she heard about most of her body, as though the size of her was the most important thing anyone could think of to mention. "Because I needed somewhere to be," she said. "And because the letter said you'd sent for me, and I—" She stopped, started again. "I don't have many places that are expecting me." He was quiet for a moment. The fire popped. "The letter's wrong," he said again, but his tone had changed. The flatness was still there, but there was something underneath it now that was harder to identify. "I know. I didn't write to any agency. I believe you." He looked at her. "Then why aren't you angrier about it?" She looked back at him steadily. "Because I climbed 2 miles of icy trail to get here, and I'm too tired to be angry tonight." He stood up, went to the pot, and poured hot water into the tin cup. He set it in front of her with a small cloth pouch. Dried herbs, she realized after a moment. Tea of some kind. "You eat?" he asked. "Not since this morning." He moved to the shelf without another word and started pulling things down. She slept in the loft. He'd cleared enough of the supply crates to make space without being asked, working around her while she sat by the fire and ate the bowl of beans and dried venison he'd heated up, and she'd watched him do it and tried to figure out what the calculation was, what he expected, what was going to be different in the morning when the practicalities of the situation had to be sorted out. She'd been in enough situations where a man's apparent kindness had a price attached that she didn't take anything at face value. Even this, the fire, the food, the cleared space in the loft, she held at a careful distance in her mind and waited to see what it would cost. But he just pointed at the ladder and said there were blankets in the chest on the left, and the roof didn't leak above the south wall. And then he'd gone to sleep in the main room by the fire without another word about it. She lay in the dark for a long time after that, listening to the wind move through the pines outside and the occasional shift of logs in the fireplace below. The blankets smelled like cedar and something else she couldn't identify, something sharp and clean. The cold pressed against the roof above her, but it couldn't quite get through, and the warmth from the fire rose up to where she was lying, and she was more comfortable than she'd been in weeks. She should have slept. She was tired enough that her bones ached. Instead, she lay awake and thought about the letter. She'd gotten it 2 weeks ago, delivered to the rooming house in Cheyenne, where she'd been staying under a false name and paying by the week from the last of the money she'd managed to take with her when she ran. The letter from Westward Hearts had been addressed to her correct name, which had scared her first. Meant someone knew where she was, and then she'd read it, and the fear had shifted into something else. A man in the Bitterroot Mountains had sent for a bride, the letter said. He'd described what he was looking for, someone capable, someone willing to work hard, someone who understood that life on the mountain wasn't gentle. He hadn't described anything about appearance, hadn't listed preferences about height or coloring or figure the way most of the correspondence she'd seen from those agencies did, with their thinly veiled requirements that really meant pretty, small, young, undemanding. He just said capable and willing. She'd written back the same day, using money she couldn't really spare for the agency fee, and Margaret Holloway had sent her the confirmation letter within a week. Ronan Mercer, the Bitterroot Range, arrival expected before the heart of winter. She'd taken the last of her money and bought a stage ticket north. Now she lay in his loft and stared at the dark ceiling and thought about the fact that he hadn't sent the letter. Someone else had, and she didn't know who, and she didn't know what that meant, and she was too far from her other options to be able to make a clean exit if this turned into something she needed to escape. She thought about the bruise on her wrist that she'd seen him notice. She thought about Alistair Granger and the way he'd looked at her across the table in her father's house 3 weeks after the funeral, like she was an inventory item that had been transferred to his ledger. She pressed her hands flat against the mattress beneath her and breathed in and out, slow and even, and told herself what she'd been telling herself for months. You're still moving. As long as you're still moving, he hasn't won. Eventually, she slept. Morning came gray and hard through the single window in the loft. Delilah was up before the light fully arrived, out of habit. She'd learned early in the last few months that lying in bed past dawn felt too much like waiting for something to find her. She came down the ladder quietly and found the main room empty. Ronan's bedroll by the fire was already folded and stacked, and the fire burned low. She built it back up without thinking about whether she should, adding wood from the pile and adjusting the damper the way she'd learned in the house she'd grown up in, where nobody had shown her directly, but she'd watched long enough to understand. By the time Ronan came in from outside, stomping snow off his boots at the door, there was fresh water heating on the fire, and she'd found enough in the pantry shelf to put together something that at least resembled breakfast. He stopped in the doorway for a moment. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know." She didn't look up from the skillet. "But I was awake, and there was food. Seemed like the right thing." He hung his coat on the hook by the door and came to the table. She set a plate in front of him. Salt pork and corn mush, nothing elegant but hot and solid, and poured 2 cups of the tea she'd found on the shelf. He looked at the plate for a moment, then at her, with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You cooked at home?" he asked. "Since I was 12. She sat down across from him. "My mother died when I was young. My father wasn't much for the kitchen." He nodded. "Ot." "We need to talk about what happens next," she said, because she'd learned that waiting for difficult conversations to happen on their own usually just meant they happened at a worse time. "Yeah," he said. "I'm not asking you to honor the letter. I understand you didn't send it, and I'm not going to hold you to something you didn't agree to." She kept her voice even. She'd practiced this, lying awake in the loft, working out what to say before the emotions of saying it could get in the way. "But I'd like to know if there's any work on this property I could do in exchange for staying until the weather breaks. I'm not—" She paused. "I'm not able to go back to where I came from, and I need somewhere to be for a while." He looked at her across the table with those careful gray eyes. "What are you running from?" he asked. Not aggressively, just directly. "A man," she said. "Not a husband. Not a man I chose. A man who thinks he has a claim on me that I don't accept." Ronan was quiet for a moment. "What kind of claim?" She looked at the table, at her hands wrapped around the tin cup. The bruise on her wrist was hidden under her sleeve, but she could feel it, the way old hurts made themselves known even when they weren't visible. "My father had debts when he died," she said. "A man named Granger held most of them. He came to the house after the funeral and told me I'd been signed over as part of the estate settlement." Her voice stayed flat, which was the only way she could say it. "He said my father had agreed to it." The silence in the cabin had a different quality now. "He said he'd send men to bring me back if I ran." She looked up at Ronan. "So I ran anyway." Ronan set his fork down. He looked at her for a long moment, not with pity, which she would have hated, and not with the particular discomfort that some men got when confronted with a woman's problems, that expression that meant, "This is too much and I'd like it to stop." He looked at her the way he'd looked at the letter last night, like something he was trying to understand before he decided what to do about it. "You said capable," she said, "in the letter. Whoever wrote it, they said that's what you wanted." "I didn't write the letter." "I know, but is it true?" He picked up his fork again, looked at the plate. "Yeah," he said. "It's true." "I'm capable," she said simply. "I know that's not what most people see when they look at me. I'm not small, and I'm not delicate, and I don't—" She stopped, recalibrated. "But I can work. I can fix things. I can think. I survived 5 weeks on the run in the middle of winter, and I climbed your mountain in the dark with everything I own on my back. That's what I am." He chewed, swallowed, drank from his cup. "Roof over the storage lean-to needs patching," he said finally, "and the smokehouse doors rotted through at the bottom hinge. I've been putting both off because there's been enough else." She nodded slowly. "I can look at both. Spring's 4 months out, maybe more at this elevation." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not promising anything past that." "I'm not asking for anything past that," she said. They ate the rest of breakfast without saying much more. Outside, the wind moved through the pines in long, low waves, and the mountains pressed down on the small cabin from every side. And somewhere above the gray overcast, the sun was going about its business without much concern for what was happening below. She picked up their plates when they were done and washed them in the basin without being asked, and he watched her do it with that careful attention he seemed to bring to everything. And neither of them said what was actually being agreed to in that small, functional room. But something was. The days that followed moved in a rhythm that was both unfamiliar and, somehow, not uncomfortable. Ronan was not a man who talked much, and he didn't pretend to be. He moved through the routines of the cabin and the mountain with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing the same things alone for long enough that he'd optimized every motion. Wood split this way, water carried that way, tools hung in a specific order that made sense once you paid attention to it. He wasn't hostile. He wasn't warm, exactly. He was just there, like the cabin and the mountain were there, present and functional, and not much interested in performing anything. Delilah found that easier than she'd expected. She'd spent most of her life in the company of people who commented on her size, on her movements, on the way she took up space in a room. People who thought their observation of her body was a gift she should thank them for, or a problem she should apologize for, or a joke she was supposed to find funny because the alternative was being difficult. She'd developed a skill for deflection and a habit of making herself quieter than she was, taking up less room than she needed, trying to smooth over the constant low friction of being seen the way she was seen. Ronan Mercer didn't comment. When she climbed onto the lean-to roof on the second day to examine the damage, he'd handed up the tools she asked for without a remark about whether she should be up there or whether the roof would hold her or anything else that most men would have said. When she patched the hole in 2 sections because the rot ran deeper than the surface damage, he looked at the finished work the same way he looked at everything, evaluating whether it was sound, not measuring it against some expectation about who had done it. She found herself working harder than she needed to, not to prove something, but because the work itself was satisfying in a way she'd almost forgotten. Building something, fixing something, making a thing hold that hadn't been holding before. The smokehouse door took most of a day. The bottom hinge had pulled completely away from the rotted wood, and replacing it meant cutting a new section of frame and resetting both hinges rather than just the broken one. She measured twice, cut once, made an error on the angle of the upper mortise and had to recut, and spent the last hour working by the light of the lantern she'd hung from the rafter inside, while the temperature outside dropped below what she wanted to think about. When she finished, the door hung level and swung clean, and the satisfaction of it was as solid and real as the wood under her hands. She was putting the tools back in order when she heard his boots on the packed snow outside. "Door's done," she said. He tried it, swung it open, swung it shut, bent down to check the bottom hinge, and ran his thumb along the joint where she'd set the new frame section. "Good work," he said. "Not good work for a woman, not better than I expected. Just good work." She put the last of the tools away and didn't say anything because there was nothing she needed to say. On. The nightmares had followed her up the mountain the way she'd been afraid they would. She woke on the 4th night with her heart pounding and the dream still behind her eyes. Granger's men at the door of the rooming house in Cheyenne, the sound of boots on the stairs, the window she'd had to go out of in the dark, and lay rigid in the loft until she could convince her body that she was not, in fact, in Cheyenne, that this was a different place, a different situation, that the sound of wind in the pines was not boots in a hallway. It took longer than she wanted it to. She didn't know if she made noise. She thought she might have, because when she came down the ladder in the morning, Ronan looked at her with a steadiness that was slightly different from his usual steadiness, and he poured her tea without being asked, and he didn't say anything about it. She almost preferred when people said something. Almost. "How long have you been up here?" she asked, sitting down with her cup. 4 years, he said. "What made you come?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "I made a mistake," he said finally. "Cost someone something they couldn't get back. I came up here because—" He stopped. "I needed to not be where I was anymore." "Did it help?" He looked at her across the table. "It stopped things from getting worse." She thought about that, about how much of what she'd done in the last few months had been motivated by the same calculation, not finding somewhere better, just somewhere that wasn't what she was leaving. "Do you want to go back?" she asked. "Eventually." "I don't know what that would look like." "No," she said. "Me neither." Outside, the snow had started again, fine and quiet, and the pines disappeared into it one by one until the world narrowed down to the cabin and the fire and the two of them sitting in the morning quiet, both carrying things that hadn't been put down yet and were still too heavy to talk about directly. But the talking had started, And that was something. She wrapped both hands around her cup and let the heat move into her palms, and the mountain pressed in from every side, and the snow fell in silence outside the window, and for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she was not running. The snow that started on the fourth morning didn't stop for 3 days. It wasn't a violent storm. No howling wind, no whiteout conditions that made the trees disappear entirely. It was the quieter, more relentless kind. The kind that just kept coming, hour after hour, adding weight to the roof and depth to the drifts, and a stillness to the world outside the cabin walls that had a quality almost like pressure, like the mountain was leaning in. Delilah had seen winters in Wyoming. She thought she knew snow. She did not know snow the way the Bitterroot Mountains knew snow. By the second morning of the storm, the drift against the north wall of the cabin was level with the bottom of the window. Ronan had already been out twice before she woke to check the roof load and clear the chimney cap and break up the ice forming at the base of the water barrel. She came down the ladder to find him pulling his coat back on after the second trip, moving with the unhurried practicality of a man who had learned not to fight the mountain's timing. "It'll go another day at least," he said without looking up. "Maybe 2. She looked at the snow pressed against the window glass. "What needs doing inside?" He glanced at her briefly, like the question mildly surprised him. "Supply inventory on the upper shelves needs sorting. Some of the grain sacks may have moisture damage I haven't had time to check." "I can do that." He nodded and went back outside. She climbed back up the ladder into the loft and started pulling sacks down from the upper shelf, checking each one, setting the damaged ones aside. It was careful, methodical work, the kind that required attention without demanding much thought, and she found that she didn't mind it. The work kept her hands busy, and when her hands were busy, her mind stayed quieter than it did when she was lying still. She found 3 sacks with moisture damage along the bottom seam, where the storage chest had let cold air in along one edge. 2 could be salvaged if the wet grain was spread and dried before mold took hold. 1 was already a loss. She brought them all down and spread the salvageable grain on a cloth near the fire, which she'd built up higher for the purpose, and she was turning it carefully when Ronan came back in from outside. He stopped when he saw what she'd done. "Third sack on the left was already gone," she said, "but the other 2 should be all right if they dry before they sit too long." He looked at the grain spread near the fire. "I was going to check those in spring." Spring would have been too late for the middle one. He hung his coat up, stood looking at the drying grain for a moment. "Yeah," he said, "you're right." She turned the grain again, working it with the cloth in slow, even movements. Outside, the snow came down and kept coming, and the fire spoke in low, irregular pops, and Ronan moved to the back shelf to start pulling down the things he needed for the day's work, without the 2 of them needing to negotiate any of it. She had thought, before coming here, that being trapped inside a small cabin with a man she barely knew for 3 days straight would be intolerable. She'd been in enough confined spaces with men whose presence felt like a pressure she had to keep track of every moment, always aware of the distance between them, always reading the room for changes in mood, always running the calculations of what was safe. Ronan wasn't like that. He was simply present. He had his work, and she had hers, and the cabin was small, but it didn't feel compressed the way some spaces felt compressed. She caught herself, on the afternoon of the second storm day, realizing that she hadn't run her usual checks in almost 2 hours, hadn't clocked where he was in the room, or braced for a change in tone, or measured his silence for something it might be hiding. She noticed the absence of that vigilance the way you sometimes notice the absence of pain, not when it was happening, but when it stopped. It didn't make her trust him, but it made her breathe differently. The storm cleared on the morning of the 3rd day, leaving everything sharp-edged and white and absolutely still. Delilah pulled her coat on and went outside before she'd finished her tea because she'd been inside long enough that the cold air hitting her face felt like relief rather than punishment. The world was entirely transformed. She stood in the clearing in front of the cabin and turned in a slow circle and looked at the mountains. She'd barely registered them when she arrived, too exhausted and focused on the immediate problem of getting to the cabin and not freezing to death on the trail. Now she had the time to look. They were enormous. Not just tall, though they were tall, the peaks above the tree line disappearing into a sky the particular hard blue that only existed at altitude in winter. They were comprehensive. They occupied the entire horizon in every direction, ridgeline after ridgeline, each one a slightly different shade of gray and white. The closer ones textured with the dark vertical lines of pine forests, and the farther ones fading into something almost abstract. She had not grown up with mountains. She had grown up in the flat country of the Wyoming basin, where the horizon was so wide and far away that you could see weather coming an hour before it arrived, and the sky made up most of what you saw in any direction. This was the opposite of that. Here, the land was the thing. The sky was just what happened in the spaces between. She didn't know if she loved it yet, but she understood why a man might come here to be alone. "Ridge above the tree line's clear," Ronan said from behind her. She hadn't heard him come out. "Means the weather'll hold for a few days at least." "How do you know?" "When the peaks above the snow line are that visible, the high pressure's still sitting over us." He looked up at the ridge line she'd been studying. "When they go hazy or you can't see the rock through the snow, something's coming." "How long did it take you to learn that?" He thought about it. "2 winters before I stopped guessing wrong." She looked at the mountains a moment longer, then down at the clearing, where the snow had buried every familiar landmark, and the paths between the cabin, the woodshed, the smokehouse, and the lean-to were all uniformly white. "Paths'll need clearing," she said. "Yeah. I can start on the one to the woodshed." He looked at her. "There's a second shovel in the lean-to." She went and got it. They worked side by side for 2 hours without talking much, clearing the main paths first, then the drainage channel along the east wall of the cabin that would back up and cause foundation trouble if it stayed packed with snow, then the approach to the water barrel. The work was hard. The snow was heavy and deep and wet near the ground, and her shoulders ached from it, and she stopped twice to catch her breath and once to move her hands inside her coat sleeves to get feeling back in her fingers. Ronan didn't say anything about the breaks. He took one himself, at a different point, standing with the shovel and looking out at the ridge the way he did when he was thinking about something he wasn't ready to say yet. By the time the main paths were done, the light had softened into mid-afternoon, and she was warm despite the temperature and tired in the satisfying way that came from doing something that needed doing. She was putting the shovel back in the lean-to when the tool rack caught her eye. She pulled the door open farther to let in more light and looked at the rack properly. The saw blade on the second hook was cracked at the heel, a bad crack, the kind that would finish splitting under real pressure. One of the draw knives had a handle that had worked loose from the tang, which meant the whole tool was an injury waiting to happen. The smaller of the 2 axes had a head that wasn't seated right. She could see the wedge had compressed, and the handle had a slight sideways play in the socket. She took the draw knife down and turned it in her hands. The handle wrap had come off on one side and the wood was bare and cracked, but the blade itself was good. If the handle was reset and wrapped properly, it would be a solid tool again. She brought it inside. "Your draw knife handle's loose," she said, setting it on the table. Ronan looked at it. "I know, haven't gotten to it. I can reset it if you have rawhide or cordage." He opened the lower cabinet on the shelf wall and pulled out a length of leather cord without comment, setting it beside the draw knife. She sat down at the table and worked carefully, heating the metal slightly at the fireplace to expand it, reseating the handle, letting it cool before wrapping the leather cord tight in a proper spiral that would hold under real use. It took the better part of an hour. Her hands knew this work from her father's shop, where she'd spent her girlhood learning things her father had intended to teach his son, and had taught her instead for lack of anyone else. Ronan watched her for a while, not hovering, just present the way he was present for most things. After a bit he came to the table and sat down with a length of rope he was rebraiding, and they worked in parallel without speaking, and the fire between them and the early dark coming down outside made the cabin feel, for that particular hour, like something other than a temporary arrangement. She didn't let herself put a name to what it felt like, but she noticed it. "Where'd you learn tool work?" he asked eventually. "My father." She didn't look up from the wrapping. "He had a repair shop. Not much money in it, but he could fix almost anything, and people always have something broken." "He teach you on purpose?" "He didn't have anyone else to teach." She wound the last section of cord and tied off the end in a knot that would hold without slipping. "My mother was gone, and I was what he had, so he taught me what he knew. That's practical." He was a practical man. "Where is he now?" She tested the draw knife handle, pressing it firmly from both sides. It held solid. "He died 8 months ago," she said. "Fever. It went fast. I'm sorry. So am I." She set the draw knife down. "He wasn't a perfect man, but he was mine." Ronan was quiet. He finished the section of rope braid he was working on and set it down and looked at the repaired draw knife on the table between them. "You did good work," he said. "I know," she said, and for the first time since she'd arrived on the mountain, she let a small, real smile show on her face. He looked at her for a moment, and something crossed his expression that she couldn't entirely read. Not discomfort, not surprise, something more complicated than either of those. And then he picked up the rope again and went back to his braiding. Outside, the darkness settled in fully, and the temperature dropped hard, and the stars above the Bitterroot Peaks were the clearest and most numerous she'd ever seen in her life. She looked at them through the cabin window for a moment before she went up the ladder that night. So many of them it looked less like a sky than like something that had been broken and scattered and was too far away to put back together. She thought her father would have liked this mountain. She lay in the loft with that thought for a while before sleep found her. The weeks that followed built on each other in small, unremarkable ways that added up to something larger than any single day suggested. She fixed the axe head, re-wedged it with a hardwood shim she cut herself, then soaked the entire head joint in the water barrel until the wood swelled tight. She repaired the cracked saw blade, which couldn't be fixed but could be replaced from the spare blades Ronan had stored in the bottom of the supply chest, and she rehung it properly on the rack so it wouldn't be stressed at the heel the way the old one had been. She found the gap in the cabin's north wall chinking where cold air was coming in along the bottom log and repacked it with a mix of clay and dried grass she found in the storage lean-to, working it into the gap with her fingers until it sat flush. Ronan didn't ask her to do any of it. She just looked at things until she understood what they needed and then did what needed doing. He brought in meat twice a week, sometimes more, and she learned what he had for preservation supplies and started working through a serious backlog of processing that apparently hadn't been a priority when he was the only one eating. She cut and dried venison strips, packed fat into the crocks she found stacked in the corner of the lean-to, boiled down bones for stock and poured it into the molds he had for that purpose. She was not delicate about the work. It was messy and smelled strongly and took most of 2 days to get the backlog under control. And she came inside both evenings with blood under her fingernails and her sleeves rolled up and her hair coming out of its pins, and Ronan looked at the work she'd done and didn't say a word about what she looked like doing it. She appreciated that more than she could have put into words. The nightmares didn't stop. They came 3 nights out of 7, sometimes more, and they were specific enough that she couldn't always talk herself down from them quickly. The worst ones were the ones where she was back in her father's house, and Granger was in the front room, and she was trying to find a way out through the back, but the door had been nailed shut, and she couldn't make her hands work the way they needed to. She always woke before the end of those. That was the one mercy. She didn't know how much noise she made. She tried not to make noise. But one morning, maybe 3 weeks after she'd arrived, she came down the ladder to find Ronan already awake and sitting at the table with his coffee and a piece of leather he was working on. And he looked up at her and said, without preamble, "You want to talk about what's following you up here at night? You can." She sat down slowly across from him. He went back to the leather work, not looking at her, not pressing. "Not yet," she said. "All right." He pushed the second cup toward her. She wrapped her hands around it and sat with it, and the fire was quiet and the morning was gray outside the window. And after a while she said, "It's a man. I told you that much." "You told me that much." "He has money." She looked at the table. "More than my father ever had, more than most people I've ever known. And where I come from, money like that is the same as being right, because there's no one who's going to tell a man like that that he's wrong." Ronan put the leather down, just set it aside and gave her his attention directly, which she'd noticed was the thing he did when he'd decided something mattered. "He told people I was his," she said. "Not his wife. Not someone he'd courted or asked or made any arrangement with. He just told people, like I was livestock that had changed hands." She stopped. The edge in her voice was showing, and she didn't entirely want it to. And the worst part was how many people just accepted it. People who knew me, people who'd known my father. They just looked at me with these expressions like, She shook her head. Like I should be grateful that someone with his money and position would bother to want something like me. The word something sat in the air between them for a moment. Ronan's jaw was set in a way she hadn't seen on him before. He put his hands on you, he said. It wasn't a question. She looked at the window, at the snow on the sill. Once, she said, before I ran, to demonstrate what happened when I said no. She heard him exhale slowly. Does he know where you went? He asked. I don't know. She turned the cup in her hands. I covered my trail as best I could, gave a different name at the rooming houses, bought my stage ticket in cash. But he has people. He has money enough to put people to looking. She glanced at Ronan. That's why I need you to know. That's why I'm telling you this. Because if someone comes up that trail asking questions about a woman, you have a right to know what that's about. He looked at her for a long moment. What's his name? He asked. Granger. Alistair Granger. He operates out of Cheyenne mostly, but he has business interests as far north as Billings. Ronan nodded once, slowly. He didn't say I've heard of him, and he didn't say I haven't, and she couldn't tell which was true. If he sends someone up this mountain, he said, I'll know before they reach the clearing. I'm not asking you to protect me, she said quickly. I know you're not. I'm asking you to know the situation. What you do with it is your decision. He picked the leather back up, worked it for a moment. I know my mountain, he said. There's not a trail up here that doesn't give you time to see what's coming. That's not me protecting you, that's just geography. She looked at him, at the careful closed face and the careful open attention that lived behind it, and thought that this was a man who had learned to say things sideways because saying them directly cost more than he usually wanted to spend. All right, she said. Geography. Geography, he confirmed. She drank her coffee, and he worked the leather, and the morning moved forward in its slow gray way, and the mountains kept their distance outside the window, holding the cabin in the particular solitude that existed at this elevation in January, and neither of them said anything else for a while. But the telling had happened, and it couldn't be untold. By the 5th week, the cabin was different. Not dramatically. Ronan would not have tolerated dramatic, and she wouldn't have imposed it, but in the accumulation of small, specific changes that happened when a place was being lived in by someone paying attention to it rather than merely enduring it. The food was better, not because she had ingredients he didn't be. She worked with exactly what was there, but because she knew things to do with those ingredients that he apparently hadn't thought of or hadn't bothered with when he was cooking only for himself. She found dried herbs in the back of the supply shelf that had been there long enough that some had lost their potency, but enough remained useful that the broth she made from them tasted like something rather than nothing. She found the honey crock he'd apparently forgotten was there, stored behind a crate of candle stubs, and the discovery of it felt out of proportion to what it actually was, like finding a small luxury in a place that had stopped expecting luxuries. She showed it to Ronan and watched something move across his face. I put that there 2 winters ago, he said. Forgot about it. There's still enough left to matter. He looked at the crock in her hands. My mother used to keep honey, he said, and the sentence ended there, not going wherever it had been headed, and she didn't push it. She put the honey in the corner of the shelf where it would be visible, where it couldn't be forgotten again. The tools were in better order. The paths between the buildings stayed clear because she maintained them as a matter of course, and the woodpile against the east wall grew because she split wood on the afternoons when Ronan was out checking the trap lines, working through the rounds he'd cut and left stacked behind the lean-to. She wasn't as fast as him, and she knew it. Her technique wasn't as efficient, and some of the harder-grained rounds she had to come at twice. But she worked through them without stopping more than she had to, and when Ronan came back late on a Tuesday afternoon and saw what she'd done, he stood for a moment looking at the new split pile without saying anything. I'm not trying to take over your work, she said quickly. You're not taking over my work, he said. You're doing extra work. It needed doing. A lot of things needed doing that I'd been letting slide. He looked at the wood a moment longer. I've been running lean up here, one set of hands. It's harder that way. Yeah. He turned toward the cabin. It is. She followed him inside and built up the fire while he hung his coat, and neither of them said anything more about it, but the acknowledgement sat in the room the way honest things did, quietly and with some weight to it. The thing she hadn't anticipated about living in close quarters with someone who didn't talk much was how much you could learn about them from other signals. She'd learned that Ronan slept badly on the nights when the wind was wrong. Not storming, just hitting the ridge at a particular angle that made a low, sustained sound she barely noticed, but that apparently kept him awake. She'd learned that he had a habit of checking the rifle by the door every time he came in, a single automatic motion that had nothing to do with thinking there was a threat. It was just something his hands did. She'd learned that he ate without preference and without complaint, but paused sometimes over the food she'd seasoned, as if the taste had reminded him of something that surprised him. She didn't ask what. That wasn't how they worked. What she didn't expect was the evening he came in late from the trapline with a hard set to his jaw and a tear in his coat sleeve that hadn't been there that morning, and she knew before he said anything that something had gone wrong out there. Not badly. He was moving fine, no favor in any limb. But something had shaken loose that he was working to put back in order. She put food on the table and didn't ask. He sat down and ate half of it and set his fork down and said, "Ice on the East Traverse gave way. I went down about 8 feet before I caught a ledge." She looked at the tear in his coat sleeve, at his wrist, where she could see a scrape that had bled and dried. "How bad?" "It's not bad. Nothing broke, nah." He picked his fork back up. "Just reminded me that I've been getting careless about that traverse, going across it the same way every time without checking first. Habit." She watched him eat for a moment. He looked at the table rather than at her, which was what he did when he was more shaken than he wanted to show. "When I first got to Cheyenne," she said, "after I ran, I thought I was being careful. I had a system. I checked the exits. I paid cash. I used a different name." She paused. "I got comfortable after 2 weeks. Stopped checking the back window the way I had been. Started sleeping past dawn." He looked up. "And one morning I heard boots on the stairs," she said, "and I realized that I'd started assuming I was safe, that the habit of feeling safer had replaced the actual checking." She met his eyes. "I went out the window." He was quiet for a moment. "How high up were you?" "Second floor. There was a ledge." She let a beat pass. "Not much of one." The corner of his mouth moved. She didn't exactly smile back, but something in her expression responded to it. And for a moment they just looked at each other across the table with the mutual understanding of two people who had each, recently and separately, learned the hard way not to stop paying attention. "I'll check the traverse before I cross it," he said. "And I'll stop sleeping past the fire going out," she said. He picked up his fork. She picked up hers. The evening moved forward, and the fire crackled, and outside the pines took the wind in long, steady waves, and the mountain held them both in its enormous, impassive quiet, and they ate the rest of the meal without talking, which by now had become its own kind of conversation. What neither of them said, what neither of them was ready to say, was that the thing being built between them in the small hours of those weeks was not the arrangement they'd agreed to. It was not two people tolerating a temporary situation for practical reasons. It was something that had started in small exchanges and tool repairs and morning silences and was growing in the specific, unannounced way that real things grew. Not because anyone decided they should, but because the conditions were right and the materials were there, and neither of them had thought to stop it. She lay in the loft that night and listened to the wind on the ridge and thought about her father, and about the long road from Cheyenne, and about the morning she'd climbed a mountain she'd never seen before to find a man who hadn't sent for her. And she thought about how strange it was that out of all the places she could have ended up, she had ended up here, in this small and functional cabin, with this quiet and careful man, and the nightmares were still coming, but they were coming less often, and her hands knew the rhythm of this place now and the rhythm of working alongside someone who asked nothing except that she be what she actually was. That was not a small thing. She had not, in a very long time, been allowed to simply be what she actually was. The wind moved through the pines in its long, steady way, and the stars above the Bitterroot peaks held their positions, and the mountain waited in its patient, enormous way for whatever would happen next. And Delilah Boone lay in the loft of a cabin that was starting, quietly and without announcement, to feel like somewhere she belonged. The warning came on a Thursday morning, delivered by a man Ronan trusted. His name was Eli Hartwell. and he ran the trading post in Harlan's Creek, 6 miles down the mountain. He was 63 years old and built like a fence post that had survived too many winters to fall over easily, and he'd been the first person to sell Ronan supplies when Ronan came up to the mountain 4 years ago without explaining himself, which Eli had apparently taken as sufficient introduction. He came up twice a year, once in fall before the hard freeze and once in late winter when the trail allowed it. And he never stayed long, and he never asked questions that weren't his business. He arrived that Thursday on horseback, moving faster than his usual pace, and Delilah knew before he dismounted that he wasn't making a social call. She was splitting wood behind the cabin when she heard the horse on the trail. She set the axe down and moved to the corner of the building where she could see the clearing without being immediately visible herself. Old habit, the kind that had kept her ahead of trouble before, and watched the rider come out of the tree line. Ronan was already at the door of the cabin. He'd heard it too. Eli pulled up and swung down from the saddle with the stiff efficiency of a man whose knees had opinions about cold mornings. He nodded at Ronan, then glanced toward where Delilah was standing at the corner of the building, and his expression was the kind that carried bad news in it, the way clouds carried weather. You could read it before it arrived. "Got something you need to hear," he said to Ronan, then to Delilah. "You too, I expect." They went inside. Eli sat at the table and accepted the cup Delilah put in front of him and wrapped both hands around it and said, "Man came through Harlan's Creek 2 days ago, came in on the south road from Billings, hired a room at the Calloway house, started asking around about a woman traveling alone. Big girl, young, brown hair, goes by Boone." He looked at Delilah directly. He wasn't subtle about it. Offered cash for information. Delilah's hands had gone still on the table in front of her. "Did anyone talk?" Ronan asked. Margaret Calloway told him she didn't rent rooms to women traveling alone, which was an outright lie. And Ned Purvis at the livery said he hadn't seen a woman matching the description since last summer, which I believe was also a lie. Eli drank from his cup. "Whether anyone else talked, I can't say for certain, but there's at least one man in that town who knows the trail up to your place, Ronan, and isn't what you'd call close-mouthed when money's involved." "Decker," Ronan said. "Decker," Eli confirmed. "I don't know that he said anything, but I know he was in the same room when the questions were being asked, and Decker's never had a loyalty that outlasted a good offer." The name Granger hadn't been said yet, but Delilah heard it in the structure of everything Eli was describing: the money, the hired man, the specificity of the description. Granger had enough resources to pay for discretion and enough arrogance not to bother with it. "Was the man alone?" she asked. Eli shook his head. "Had 2 others with him, stayed in the stable. Not the kind of men you'd want to have a drink with." She looked at Ronan. He was leaning against the wall near the fireplace with his arms crossed, and that particular stillness he had when he was thinking several steps ahead and didn't want the thinking interrupted. His eyes were on the middle distance somewhere between the table and the wall, and she could see the calculation moving behind them. "How long ago did they leave town?" he asked. "Yesterday morning, early. I rode as soon as I could." Eli set his cup down. "Could be they went south again. Could be they're on their way up." "Then they're already on the lower trail," Ronan said. He pushed off the wall. "The south approach from the Calloway Road takes about 4 hours if you know the way. 6 if you don't." He looked at the window. The light was mid-morning. "We have time. Not a lot." Eli stood up. "I'd stay and help, but I'm too old to be useful in a confrontation, and too smart to pretend otherwise." "You already helped," Ronan said. "More than you know." Eli buttoned his coat and moved to the door. He paused there and looked at Delilah with an expression she hadn't expected from a man she'd met 20 minutes ago. Not pity, not the measuring look men sometimes gave women in difficult situations, something more straightforward than either of those. Respect, maybe. The kind that came from watching how someone sat with bad news. "Ronan's a hard man to find trouble with on his own ground," Eli said to her, "for what that's worth." Then he went out to his horse and rode back down the mountain. The cabin was very quiet for a moment after he left. Delilah sat at the table and looked at the grain of the wood and let herself feel for just that moment the full weight of what was coming up the trail toward her. Not just the fear of it, though the fear was there, the specific tight cold of it that she knew well by now, but the exhaustion of it. The bone-deep weariness of running and hiding and calculating and looking over her shoulder for months, only to have it find her anyway on a mountain she'd climbed in the dark, thinking she might finally be far enough. She let herself feel it for about 30 seconds. Then she stood up. "Tell me about the south approach," she said to Ronan. "Every foot of it." He looked at her for a moment. "You're not going to go somewhere safe?" he asked. Not dismissively, just checking. "There isn't anywhere safe," she said, "and I'm done letting him drive me." Something settled in Ronan's expression. Not relief, exactly. More like confirmation of something he'd suspected but hadn't wanted to assume. "Sit down," he said. "I'll tell you the trail. Choche." He knew the south approach to his mountain the way he knew his own hands. Every grade change, every exposed section, every place where the trail narrowed or crossed uncertain ground. He'd spent 4 winters on this mountain specifically because knowing terrain was the one advantage that reliably outweighed everything else, and he'd made it his business to know every inch of this one. The trail from the Callaway Road had 3 sections that mattered. The first was the lower creek crossing, a half-mile flat before the real climb started, where the trail passed through a dense stand of bare alder. Visibility was poor in there, and the ground was wet enough in winter that horses moved slow. It wasn't a place you'd want to be caught in if you didn't know where the dry footing was. The second was the Narrows, a section about 2/3 of the way up, where the trail squeezed between a rock face on the left and a steep drop on the right, barely wide enough for 2 men abreast. You couldn't bring horses through it at a pace, and you couldn't easily turn around in it if something blocked the way ahead. The third was the final grade into the clearing, a steep open section that left anyone approaching exposed to the cabin for the last 200 feet with nowhere to take cover except the trees at the bottom. 3 men, 3 problems, and a woman at the table who was looking at the map he'd sketched on the back of a piece of wrapping paper with the focused, practical attention of someone who'd been thinking about this longer than this morning. "The Narrows," she said, pointing. "Can you block it?" "Not block it, but I can make it discouraging." "How?" He explained. She listened without interrupting, which was something he'd noticed about her. She listened the way someone listened when they were actually going to use what they heard, not just waiting for their turn to speak. "If they get through the Narrows," she said, "they're going to come up that open grade and they're going to know exactly where they're going." "Yes. So they can't get through the Narrows with their horses." "Correct." "What happens to 3 men on foot in unfamiliar snow at this elevation in January when their horses are stuck below them?" He looked at her. "They get cold and frustrated and they make mistakes. And a man making mistakes in snow he doesn't know falls down," he said simply, "or gets turned around, or decides the contract isn't worth what he's being paid." She tapped the map. "So the Narrows is the point." "The Narrows is the point." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the sketch. Her finger moved to the lower creek crossing. "If I was ahead of them at the alder stand," she said slowly, "I could see how many horses we're actually dealing with. Confirm the numbers." He looked at her. "No. Not to confront them. Just to see. If they see you, so they won't see me." She met his eyes steadily. "I spent 5 weeks moving through towns where people were looking for me. I know how to not be seen." He wanted to argue with it. The argument wouldn't hold, and he knew it. She was right about what she could do, and he was right that the information would be useful. And the 2 things were true at the same time, and he didn't particularly like it. "You'd have to be back up here before they reach the Narrows," he said. "How long does the lower section take?" "On foot, in this snow, without knowing the trail? An hour minimum. Probably more." "Then I have time." "If you're wrong about the timing, then I move fast." She looked at him with that particular directness that he'd stopped being surprised by. "Ronan, I am not a woman who needs to be kept back from things. I've been running from this man for months, and I am tired of running from things." He was quiet for a moment. "You go to the first bend in the alder stand," he said. "Not further. You count horses and men, and you get back up here. That's all." "That's all," she agreed. He held her gaze for another moment and then looked back at the map. Because there was more to work out, and the morning was moving whether they were ready or not. She moved through the alder stand like she was part of it. The trees were bare in January, their branches a gray tangle against the gray sky, and the snow between them was broken up by exposed root systems and creek ice that made the footing unpredictable. She'd pulled her dark coat over her lighter inner layer and moved with her shoulders low and her steps careful, testing each footfall before committing her weight, the way Ronan had shown her to move on uncertain ground. She heard them before she saw them. 3 horses, moving slow on the icy trail. The creak of leather and the muffled sound of hooves in packed snow. Men's voices, not loud, the particular tone of men who were working rather than talking. She eased herself behind the root ball of a fallen alder and went still. They came around the lower bend in a loose line. 3 horses, as Eli had said, and 4 men, not 3. The extra man was riding double on the rear horse, which meant they hadn't planned for the terrain and had lost a horse somewhere on the south road, which told her something useful about how well prepared they actually were. The man in front she didn't recognize. Big, dark-coated, moving with the ease of someone who did this kind of work regularly. Behind him, 2 more in the middle, talking in low voices she couldn't quite make out. And then the 4th man, on the rear horse. She recognized Alistair Granger the way you recognize something that had appeared in enough nightmares to become familiar. He was 52, silver-haired, broad-shouldered in the way that men who had once been physically imposing carried that quality into age, even when the actual power had softened. He was dressed for the mountains, she gave him that, in a heavy coat and proper winter gear, and he sat his horse with the ease of a man accustomed to having things go where he pointed them. He was looking at the trail ahead with the expression she remembered from her father's front room, patient, certain. The expression of a man who considered it only a matter of time. She pressed herself flat behind the root ball and didn't breathe loud, and counted to 30 after they passed before she moved. Then she went back up the mountain at a pace that burned her lungs and made her thighs ache in the deep snow, and she didn't slow down until she saw the clearing. Ronan had been busy. The Narrows, when she'd gone down past it on her way to the alder stand, had been just what it always was. A tight section of trail between rock and drop, uncomfortable but passable. When she came back through it 40 minutes later, it was something else. He'd worked fast and he'd worked smart. A series of snares set at ankle height across the trail entrance, the kind that wouldn't stop a man but would absolutely stop a horse and would catch a man's boot at the wrong moment and put him down hard. Above that, at the narrowest point, a length of rope strung at shoulder height between the rock face and a pine trunk, nearly invisible against the gray stone in the flat winter light. And along the left side of the drop, he'd knocked loose the snow from the rock face above, leaving a section of trail that was now covered in a layer of loose, uneven ice chunks that would turn under a boot in ways flat snow wouldn't. It wasn't a killing ground. It was an inconvenience ground, the kind of inconvenience that, at this elevation in January with uncertain footing and an unknown trail ahead of you, added up to the same thing as a wall. She found him at the top of the Narrows, setting the last snare, and she crouched beside him and said, low and quick, 4 men, not 3. He's with them. He came himself. Ronan's hands paused on the snare line. Granger is on the trail. Yes. He looked up at the Narrows, at the work he'd done. Then he looked at her. You all right? I'm fine. She was breathing hard from the climb, and her hands were cold inside her gloves, and her pulse hadn't fully settled since she'd seen Granger's face through the alder branches. But she was upright and functional, and that was all right. He sees it as property, she said, not meaning to say it out loud exactly, but saying it anyway. That's not a thing you argue with. You can't make a man like that understand because he's not confused. He just doesn't consider understanding necessary. Ronan stood up from the snare and looked at her fully. Then we don't argue, he said. They went back up to the cabin. The wait was the hardest part. She'd expected action to be hard. She'd thought she'd be afraid of the moment of confrontation. Instead, what she found was that the waiting was what her mind didn't know what to do with. She sat by the window and watched the tree line and told herself to breathe at a normal rate, and mostly failed. Ronan moved through the cabin without urgency, doing the things that needed doing the way he always did them. But she noticed that he positioned himself differently than usual, standing where he could see both the window and the door, moving with that particular economy that meant he was ready rather than relaxed. He's going to claim the debt is legal, she said. He'll have papers. I expect he will. He's brought them with him before, to the rooming house in Cheyenne. He had a man show them to the landlady. She looked at her hands. They looked official. I don't know if they were. Do you know anyone who'd have known your father's debts? An actual record of them? She thought about it. My father dealt with a man named Colson at the Cheyenne land office. He handled my father's property registration. He would have known what was owed and to who. Ronan nodded. That's something. She looked at him. You're thinking ahead to after. I'm always thinking ahead to after. What if after doesn't? It will, he said. Not forcefully, just the same flat certainty with which he said most things. She wanted to push back on that, wanted to explain to him the specific, exhausting reality of a man like Granger, the way money and certainty and the quiet cooperation of everyone around him made him almost more than a person, made him a condition of the landscape that you simply had to accommodate. She'd spent months believing that was true. She found, looking at Ronan's expression, that she wasn't entirely sure she still believed it. The sound from the tree line came about 2 hours after she'd come back up from the alder stand. Not a call, just the sounds of men coming through terrain that was fighting them. The thud of a fall, a sharp exclamation, the high nervous sound of a horse that had been pushed too hard through unfamiliar ground and was telling its rider about it. Ronan was already at the door. Stay back until I've spoken to them, he said. I won't hide. I'm not asking you to hide. I'm asking you to let me speak first. She held his gaze. All right. He went out. She waited about 20 seconds, then she went and stood in the doorway. 3 of the 4 men came out of the trees. The hired men had gotten through, though one was limping and another had a long tear in his coat sleeve from where he'd caught himself on something coming through the narrows. The horses hadn't made it. Granger came last, on foot, and she could see from his posture that the climb and the narrows had cost him something in dignity that he was working to recover, pulling his coat straight and setting his jaw and doing his best to look like a man who had arrived on his own terms. He didn't look like that. He looked like a man who'd fallen down twice in the snow and was very angry about it. Ronan stood in the center of the clearing with his arms at his sides and said nothing at all. Granger stopped about 15 feet from him. His eyes went past Ronan immediately, found Delilah in the doorway, and something moved across his face that she recognized. Not anger exactly, but the expression that came before it, the calculation, the assessment of resistance. Mercer, he said. He'd found out the name then. I'm not here to quarrel with you. I have legal business with the woman in your doorway. Say what you've come to say, Ronan said. Granger reached into his coat and produced a folded document. Debt settlement executed legally in the territory of Wyoming, witnessed and filed. The woman Delilah Boone was listed as a material asset in her father's estate and transferred to satisfaction of outstanding debt owed to Alistair Granger Enterprises. He extended the document toward Ronan. I'm not stealing, I'm collecting. Ronan didn't take the document. A woman is not a material asset, he said. The courts of Wyoming disagree. Then the courts of Wyoming are wrong. Granger's expression shifted. He was a man accustomed to resistance coming with apologies, with qualifications, with the nervous deference that money usually bought. Flat contradiction without any of those accessories seemed to confuse him slightly. She is under contract. She is under my protection, Ronan said. On my land, which you entered without invitation. This is not a matter of invitation. This is a matter of law. Show me a territorial marshal and I'll discuss the law. Ronan's voice hadn't changed in volume or temperature through any of this. You brought hired men and a piece of paper and rode up a mountain in January. That's not law. That's pressure. Granger looked at the hired men flanking him, then back at Ronan. His eyes went to the rifle that Ronan had not raised, that was simply there, present and noted. He looked at the cleared paths, the solid cabin, the signs of a place that had been worked and maintained and knew itself. He was a man who was very good at reading situations, and what he was reading right now was not what he'd expected to find. He looked at Delilah, and she stepped forward. She came down off the step of the doorway and walked across the snow toward him, and she stopped close enough that she didn't have to raise her voice. And she looked at him directly, the way she had not been able to look at him the last time she'd been this close to him, in her father's house with his hand around her wrist and her heart slamming against her ribs. I'm not going back with you, she said. Delilah. He used her name with the particular familiarity of someone establishing ownership over something. This is not a decision you have the standing to make. It's the only decision I have the standing to make. She kept her voice flat and even. You came to my father's house 3 weeks after he was in the ground and told me I belonged to you. You showed me papers I hadn't signed and agreements I hadn't made, and you told me my life had been settled like a bill of sale. She watched his face. The confidence was still there, but something under it was shifting, and she pressed forward. I want you to hear me say this clearly so there is no confusion between us. I don't accept it. I never accepted it. You can have every piece of paper in that coat, and it doesn't change what you actually are, which is a man who tried to purchase a human being and is angry that it didn't take. The silence in the clearing had a particular quality. The hired men were very still. The wind moved through the pines at the edge of the clearing in a long, low wave and then settled. Granger's face had gone through several things and arrived at a coldness she recognized. You'll regret— No, she said. I won't. There are courts. Go to them. She held his gaze and did not look away. Go to every court in Wyoming and show them your papers. And while you're at it, explain to each one of them how you came to believe that a woman's body was a settlable debt. Explain that to the men who knew my father. Explain it to the land office in Cheyenne that has records of what my father actually owed and to who and when. Explain it publicly, with witnesses, and see how that sits with the men you do business with. She let a beat go by. Or you can go back down this mountain. It was not a threat. It was quieter than a threat. It was a statement of options from someone who had worked out the terrain. Granger looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Ronan, who hadn't moved. He looked at his hired men, one of whom was still favoring his left leg from the narrows and was in no condition to be enthusiastic about anything. He looked at the mountain above the clearing, at the peaks against the cold blue sky, at the total indifference of the landscape to everything he was. He folded the document and put it back in his coat. This isn't finished, he said. It is for today, Ronan said from behind her. Granger turned and walked back toward the trees, and his men went with him, and the sounds of their descent, slow and difficult and graceless on the trail they didn't know, faded through the pines until the clearing was quiet again. She stood in the snow with her hands at her sides and her heart hitting hard against her chest and the cold air filling her lungs in long, unsteady pulls, and she did not move until she was certain she could do so without her legs giving her trouble. Then Ronan was beside her. He didn't touch her, didn't say anything immediately, just stood next to her in the clearing while the mountain settled back into its usual silence and the wind came through the pines in that long, low way it had, and the sky was very bright and very cold and very far above them. You knew about Colson, he said after a while. The man at the land office. You had that ready. I've had time to think, she said. Running gives you time to think. The debt record. Is it real? Would Colson actually have documentation that contradicts Granger's papers? She was quiet for a moment. I don't know, she said honestly. But Granger doesn't know I don't know. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in that direction. She turned and looked at him, and the expression on his face was the closest thing to unguarded she'd seen from him, something that had been working toward the surface for weeks and had just arrived. You did that yourself, he said. What just happened? You held the ground, she said. I needed someone to hold the ground first. You would have found another way if I hadn't. She looked at the tree line where Granger and his men had disappeared, at the broken trail they'd left in the snow, at the evidence of their departure written in the white ground of the clearing. Maybe, she said, but it was better this way. She meant something more than the practical outcome of the confrontation, and she thought he understood that, because he nodded once slowly and looked back at the mountains with the particular expression he had when he was putting something in order inside himself that he'd have to find different words for later. The mountain held them both in its enormous quiet, and the pines moved in the wind, and the afternoon light came down cold and clean and indifferent across the snow. And Delilah Boone stood in the clearing of a cabin she had not been sent for and looked at the empty trail below and felt something she had almost stopped believing she was capable of feeling. Not safety, exactly. Not yet. but something adjacent to it, something that had room to grow. Granger didn't come back. Not the next day, not the day after that. The trail below the clearing stayed empty, and the narrows stayed quiet. And after a week had passed without a rider coming out of the tree line, Delilah stopped positioning herself near the window every time she heard a sound from the mountain. The habit didn't die all at once. Habits built from fear rarely did. But it loosened, the way a fist loosened when the reason for clenching was finally, provisionally, gone. What remained was everything that the threat had been sitting on top of. She noticed it on the fourth morning after the confrontation, when she woke before light and lay in the loft and realized that the first thought in her head wasn't listen for something wrong, but simply, the fire will need building. Such a small thing. The kind of thing a person who felt safe thought without noticing they were thinking it, because their mind wasn't already occupied with something more urgent. She lay there for a moment with that thought and felt the specific, unfamiliar quality of it. Then she got up and built the fire. Ronan noticed the change in her before she fully named it herself. He noticed most things before they were named. It was a quality she'd come to associate with him specifically, that particular attention that operated below the level of comment. He didn't say you seem different or you seem better. He just stopped, one morning about a week after Granger's visit, in the middle of eating breakfast, and looked at her across the table with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "You laughed." She had laughed at something she'd said herself, a dry observation about the way the cabin's one window fogged up in the morning in a pattern that looked distinctly like a man making an unpleasant face. It hadn't been much, more of an exhale with some warmth in it than an actual laugh. "Is that unusual?" she asked. "For you, yeah," he said. "A little." She looked at her plate. "I suppose it has been." He went back to eating. She went back to eating. But something had been noted between them that hadn't been there before. Some small acknowledgement that the person sitting across the table was more than the sum of what she'd been surviving. The guilt came out of Ronan on a Tuesday evening, unexpectedly, the way things came out of people who had been holding them too long in too small a space. They'd been working on the storage lean-to together. She'd been suggesting for 2 weeks that the roofline needed resetting, that the angle wasn't shedding snow properly and was accumulating load at the center beam, and he'd agreed with the assessment but kept finding other things to do first. That Tuesday, he finally got up from the table after breakfast and said, "Lean-to today," and she'd followed him out without discussion. The work was harder than either of them had expected. The center beam had sagged more than it looked from below, and resetting it required propping the entire roof structure while they worked the beam back into position, which meant 2 people holding things in specific places at specific moments and communicating clearly about what was happening. It was the most directly collaborative work they'd done, requiring more talking than their usual parallel routines, more of the quick back and forth of people solving a physical problem together in real time. By late afternoon, the beam was reset and braced, and the roofline was correct, and they were both tired and cold and sitting on the woodpile outside the lean-to sharing the water jug. The light was going in that particular way it went in winter at this elevation, fast and golden and final, the shadows coming out of the trees and crossing the clearing while the peaks above stayed lit for another half hour. She was watching it without thinking much when Ronan said, without preamble, "The thing that brought me up here, the mistake I told you about." She looked at him. He was looking at the tree line. "You don't have to," she started. "I know I don't have to." He turned the water jug in his hands. "I have a brother. Had mostly. We haven't spoken in 3 years. His name is Cal." He paused. "When we were younger, we trapped together. Same territory, different sections of it. We had an arrangement that worked for a long time." She waited. "I was moving too fast one season," he said, "trying to cover more ground than the time allowed. Made a decision about a route without checking it properly, the way I talked about with the East Traverse. Just assumed the conditions were what they'd been the previous year." He stopped, worked the jug between his palms. "Cal was following the route I'd marked. Ice gave way on a river crossing I'd marked as solid. He went in." The clearing was very quiet. "He got out," Ronan said. "Cold water in January, you don't last long, but he was close enough to shore and strong enough. He got out." A pause. "Lost 2 fingers on his right hand to the cold before he could get a fire going." She absorbed that, He told me it wasn't my fault, Ronan said. He said it like he meant it, which was the worst part, because I knew whose fault it was, and his telling me it wasn't didn't change the arithmetic. He looked at the peaks still lit above the shadow line. I couldn't look at his hand, couldn't be in the same room with him without, I don't know, without needing to go somewhere that wasn't there. So you came up here, she said. I came up here. He set the jug down on the woodpile between them. Told myself I needed to think. Stayed a winter, then another. Stopped knowing how to leave. She thought about what to say. She'd gotten better in her time on this mountain, at not rushing to fill silences, at letting things sit at their actual weight instead of papering over them with the first words that came to hand. Does he know where you are? She asked. Eli Hartwell does. Eli would get word to him if something happened to me up here. He glanced at her. Beyond that, I don't know. Have you written to him? A long pause. No. Do you want to? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. I don't know what I'd say. You don't have to know the whole letter, she said. You just have to know the first line. He looked at her. The light had dropped another degree, and his face was in shadow now, which somehow made his expression easier to read, the way some things were clearer when you weren't looking at them directly. What's the first line? He asked. Whatever you've been not saying for 3 years. He looked back at the mountains. She watched his jaw work slightly, some internal negotiation happening that he wasn't narrating. He lost 2 fingers because of my carelessness, he said, and I couldn't stand what that meant about me. So I left him with the loss and took myself somewhere I didn't have to see it. He exhaled. That's the first line. That's the whole letter, she said quietly. He didn't say anything else for a moment. I've been carrying that up here for 4 years, he said, thinking if I stayed long enough, it would... He stopped. Become smaller? Yeah. Does it? No. He picked the water jug back up and stood. It just becomes familiar. She stood too, her knees stiff from sitting on the cold woodpile. The last light was leaving the peaks now, and the temperature was dropping in that sudden way that always caught her slightly off guard, even after weeks of experiencing it. Familiar isn't the same as settled, she said. No, he agreed. It isn't. They went inside and she built the fire up while he hung his coat, and neither of them said anything more about Cal or about letters or about the particular kind of guilt that came from failing someone who forgave you anyway. But something had shifted in the room. Not resolved, not fixed, but moved. Like a stone that had been in one place so long it had made a depression in the ground beneath it, and had finally been picked up, and the shape of where it had been was still there, but the weight of it was different now that it was in someone's hands rather than buried. Shemek. February came in with the cold that was different from January's cold. Drier, sharper, the kind that cracked wood and made the cabin's joints talk at night as the logs contracted. The days were still short, but visibly, incrementally longer than they'd been in December, and the angle of the afternoon light had shifted enough that it reached the south window now in a way it hadn't for months, laying a pale rectangle across the floor in the late afternoon that moved slowly from the table to the wall as the hours went by. Delilah found herself watching it sometimes. The movement of that light, the way it marked time passing in a way that was concrete and unhurried. She'd started thinking about what came after, not in a frightened way, the way she'd spent the last several months thinking about what came after. Always the next town, the next rooming house, the next careful calculation about who was looking and where the exits were. But in the ordinary way that people thought about the future when the immediate present wasn't an emergency. What she wanted, what was possible, what could be built from what was actually here. She thought about this while she worked, which meant she thought about it most of the day, and she turned it over the way she turned grain drying near the fire, carefully, without forcing it, waiting for it to arrive at what it actually was. What she knew was this: she didn't want to leave. She'd been waiting for that feeling to reveal itself as something else, as temporary relief, as simple exhaustion, as the kind of attachment that came from proximity and shared hardship rather than anything real. She'd been waiting for the morning she woke up and found that what she felt in this cabin, toward this mountain and this man, was just the residue of having nowhere else to go. That morning didn't come. What came instead was a Sunday afternoon in the middle of February when Ronan came inside from checking the trapline and set a small package on the table, brown paper tied with cord, and said, "From Eli's last supply run," without explanation, and went to hang up his coat. She opened it. Inside was a small sewing kit. Not elaborate, a few needles, a card of different thread weights, a pair of scissors that were actually sharp, a thimble that was slightly too large for her finger but workable. The kind of thing that was purely practical and also, in its particularity, the kind of thing someone bought because they'd noticed a specific absence. She sat looking at it for a moment. Her sewing kit had been one of the things she'd left behind when she went out the Cheyenne window. She hadn't mentioned that to Ronan. She hadn't mentioned it to anyone. "How did you know?" she asked. He was at the washstand with his back to her. "You've been mending things with a needle you borrowed from the harness kit," he said. "Harness needles too large for cloth work." She looked at the back of his head, at the set of his shoulders, which she'd learned to read the way she'd learned to read the weather on the ridge. Not always predictable, but legible if you paid attention. "Thank you," she said. "It's practical," he said. Which was, she had come to understand, the way Ronan Mercer said most things that meant more than practical. She put the sewing kit on the shelf near her side of the table. She'd developed a side of the table somewhere in the last few weeks, without either of them designating it, and went back to the work she'd been doing, and the afternoon moved forward in its quiet way, and the rectangle of pale light traveled across the floor from the table to the wall, and then faded as the sun dropped behind the western ridge. The conversation about the homestead happened on a night when the wind was wrong on the ridge. She'd noticed by now that Ronan slept badly on those nights, and she'd started keeping her own sleep light when the sound came. Not because she could do anything about it, but because waking alone in the dark to the sound of something strange felt worse when you were the only one awake. On this particular night, she came down the ladder at some point past midnight to find him already sitting at the table with a cup and the lantern turned low. She sat down across from him without saying anything, and he pushed the coffee pot toward her. "The thing about this place," he said after a while, "is that it's too much for one person." She looked at him. "You've managed it." "I've managed the minimum of it. There's 60 acres above the cabin that I've never done anything with. Good flat ground up there, some of it. Decent soil under the rock layer." He looked at the lantern. "My first winter up here I had plans. Going to build out, put in a proper root cellar, expand the storage, maybe run a few head of cattle in the upper pasture. What stopped you?" "Point of the exercise was to be alone," he said. "Hard to justify building for more when you're not planning for more." She turned her cup in her hands. "And now?" He looked at her across the lantern light. His face in that low light was neither the closed, careful face he wore during the day, nor the unguarded expression she sometimes caught briefly and then watched him pull back. It was something in between, something that belonged specifically to the particular vulnerability of the middle of the night. "I wrote to Cal," he said. She went still. 2 weeks ago. Gave the letter to Eli on his last run." He looked at the table. "Didn't say everything, couldn't get it all into one letter. But I said enough that he'll know that I haven't just been up here not thinking about it." "That's good," she said carefully. "Ronan, I don't know if he'll write back." "He might not right away." "No." He was quiet. "But it's sent. It's out of my hands now." Something moved across his face. "That's a strange feeling." "Letting something out of your hands?" "Letting the outcome be someone else's to decide." She understood that. She'd lived inside the opposite of it for most of her adult life. The constant management of every variable, the exhausting work of controlling what could be controlled because the alternative was too frightening to sit with. "You gave Eli another letter, too," she said. It wasn't quite a question. He looked at her. "What makes you say that?" "Because Eli came back last week with that sewing kit, and you knew to ask for it specifically." She held his gaze. "You wrote to Cheyenne, to the land office." A pause. "I wrote to a man named Colson," he said. "Asked him to pull whatever records existed on a Daniel Boone's estate debts and the creditors named in them. Told him I had reason to believe there were discrepancies between the official record and what a man named Granger has been representing to people. She felt something in her chest do something complicated. "You didn't tell me," she said. "I wasn't sure it would come to anything. Didn't want to—" He stopped. "Didn't want to give me something to hope for that might not hold." "Yeah." She looked at the table, at her hands, at the sewing kit on the shelf across the room, which she understood now was not just a practical item, but a piece of a larger thing he'd been quietly building without announcement, the way he built most things. "Coulson might not find anything," she said. "He might not. But if Granger's papers are fabricated or inflated, and the way he moved up here tells me he's a man who expects money to do his legal work for him without anyone checking, there'll be a record that contradicts them." He turned his cup. "At minimum, it gives you ground to stand on if he tries the courts." He said this wasn't finished. Men like that always say that. His voice was even. "It doesn't mean they're right." She sat with that for a moment, with the quiet fact of what he'd done. Written letters, made inquiries, used what small leverage he had in the world on her behalf, without telling her, without making it into something she owed him. "Why?" she asked. Not accusingly, just needing to hear the answer in words. He looked at her for a long moment. The lantern light moved slightly in a draft from the north wall, and his face shifted with it, and she saw something there that had been working toward the surface for weeks. "Because what was done to you was wrong," he said. "And I had some ability to push back on it, so I did." She nodded. That was a true answer. She suspected it wasn't the complete answer, but it was true. And she wasn't going to push past true at midnight with the wind on the ridge and both of them tired. "The 60 acres above the cabin," she said. "The flat ground." He looked at her. "Show me in the morning," she said. "I want to see what it could be." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the pines in that long, low wave, and the cabin creaked once in the cold, and the lantern held its small circle of light between them. "All right," he said. They sat a while longer without saying much more. The wind settled sometime past 2 in the morning, and the ridge went quiet, and Delilah went back up the ladder and lay in the loft and looked at the dark ceiling. And for the first time since her father's house, she thought about the future without the thought turning immediately into a calculation of escape routes. She thought about 60 acres of flat ground above a cabin in the Bitterroot Mountains. She thought about root cellars and cattle and a proper larder built for 2 instead of 1. She thought about a man who wrote letters on her behalf without telling her, and bought her a sewing kit because he'd noticed she was making do without one. She thought about how strange it was that the place she hadn't been sent to had become the place she most clearly belonged. She didn't name what was growing between them. She wasn't ready for the name yet, and she thought he probably wasn't either, and that was all right. Some things grew better without being labeled too early, the way certain seeds needed dark and quiet before they were ready for anything as direct as light. But it was growing, she knew that much. She fell asleep to the sound of the mountain settling into its deep winter quiet, and she did not dream of Cheyenne, and she did not dream of running. And when the morning came gray and cold through the loft window, she was already half awake and thinking about what 60 acres of good flat ground might look like under a February sky. The fire needed building. She went down and built it. He showed her the upper 60 acres on a Wednesday morning when the sky was clear and the cold was dry and the snow on the flat ground above the cabin caught the light in a way that made everything look both larger and more possible than it had any right to. They climbed the ridge behind the cabin through a section of pine that thinned out near the top and then opened abruptly onto the flat. And it was flat, genuinely flat, in a way that surprised her. A broad shelf of land tucked against the mountain's shoulder, like something had been deliberately set aside up here and then forgotten. The snow lay unbroken across it. Animal tracks crossed it in several places. Deer, something smaller she couldn't identify. But no human tracks, no structures, nothing that marked it as used. She stood at the edge of it and turned in a slow circle. "How far does it run?" she asked. "About a quarter-mile north to south, wider east to west." He came to stand beside her, looking out across the white expanse. "The soil's rocky in the east section, but the west side has good depth. I found that the first summer. Put a test stake down to see what was under the snow layer." "You were serious about building out," she said, "for about a month." He looked at the flat ground. Then I stopped thinking about it. She looked at where the tree line curved around the north end of the shelf, at the way the mountain rose behind it and blocked the worst of the north wind, at the angle of the sun. Still low this time of year, but falling directly on this face of the mountain without obstruction. Good light. Protected from the worst weather. Ground that could hold something if someone put work into it. A root cellar would go there, she said, pointing to the northwest corner where the ground rose slightly before leveling off again. Natural drainage away from the structure, and cattle could winter in the south section. There's enough shelter from the ridge. He looked at where she was pointing. You've thought about this. I've thought about it since you mentioned it. She turned to look at him directly. Ronan, this is good land. I know it is. Then why are you looking at it like it's something you're not sure you deserve? He was quiet for a moment. The wind came across the flat in a long, clean sweep and moved his coat and was gone. He looked at the ground under the snow, at the peaks above, at the distance between where they were standing and where the cabin sat below them, visible through the gap in the pines. I came up here to make myself smaller, he said. Take up less. Be less of a problem to anyone. Did it work? For a while it felt like it was working. He looked at her. Then you showed up. She held his gaze, and made you larger again. Made me remember what large felt like. He said it without drama, just the flat honesty that was the only register he had for things that actually mattered to him. I forgot that wasn't the same as being dangerous. She understood what he meant. She'd done her own version of the same thing, made herself quieter, smaller, less than she was, for so long that she'd started to confuse diminishment with safety, as if taking up less space would somehow make the world less inclined to push against her. It's a lie they tell you, she said, that being less will protect you. It doesn't. It just makes you easier to overlook. He nodded slowly. Yeah. And overlooked isn't safe, it's just invisible. They stood on the flat ground above the cabin and looked at what it could be, and neither of them said the obvious thing yet. That could be and will be were different words. That one of them required a decision that hadn't been made out loud. But the shape of the decision was there between them, the same way the shape of a structure was present in a piece of land before the first stake went in. It was there. It was only waiting for someone to begin. Coulson's letter arrived in the first week of March, carried up by Eli on his monthly run with the same unhurried reliability that characterized everything Eli did. Delilah was splitting wood behind the cabin when Eli came into the clearing. She set the axe down and wiped her hands on her coat and went to meet him, and she could see from the way he reached into his coat pocket that he'd been carrying the letter carefully, which meant he knew what it was. He handed it to her without comment. She turned it over. Her name on the front, care of Eli Hartwell, Harlan's Creek. The return address was the Cheyenne Territorial Land Office. She put it in her coat pocket without opening it and went to find Ronan. He was in the lean-to working on the harness, and he looked up when she came in and saw her face and set the harness down immediately. It came, she said. She opened it at the table, with Ronan sitting across from her and Eli standing near the door with his coffee. Because Eli had apparently decided he was staying for this, and she didn't have any objection to that. The letter was 3 pages, written in a precise, official hand. She read it through once fast and then went back to the beginning and read it again more slowly, because the first time through she wasn't certain she was reading it correctly. She was reading it correctly. Thomas Coulson had pulled every record associated with her father's estate. The original land registration, the debt ledger filed with the territory at the time of Daniel Boone's death, the creditor notification sent in the weeks following. What he found was this. Alistair Granger had held a legitimate debt against her father's estate. The amount was real. The debt was real. What was not real, what Coulson had identified with careful, precise language that nonetheless communicated clear outrage, was the settlement document claiming Delilah herself as a transferable asset. That document had been filed 6 weeks after her father's death, backdated to appear contemporaneous with the original debt agreement, and bore a witness signature that belonged to a man who had died 4 months before the date on the document, a dead witness. Granger had forged a debt settlement document and signed it with the dead man's name, apparently assuming that no one in Cheyenne would look closely enough to notice the discrepancy in dates. He had not counted on Thomas Colson, who had apparently taken Ronan's letter as a personal challenge and had looked very closely indeed. The final paragraph of Colson's letter stated that he had filed a formal complaint with the territorial court and had forwarded copies of all documentation to the federal circuit judge who handled territorial fraud cases. Granger had been notified. His attorneys had already responded, which Colson noted with a certain dry satisfaction meant they were worried. She set the letter down on the table. The cabin was very quiet. "It was forged," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "The whole thing. He forged my father's signature on a settlement document and backdated it, and used a dead man as his witness." Eli made a sound that contained several things at once, none of them polite. Ronan looked at the letter, at her. "You knew something was wrong with it." "I knew it didn't feel right. I didn't have the words for it." She looked at her hands on the table. "I believed him. Not that he was right. I never believed he was right. But I believed there was enough of a legal structure around what he was doing that I couldn't fight it directly. That's why I ran instead of staying to argue." "You were alone," Ronan said, "and he had money and lawyers and a document that looked official. And I was a big, plain, fatherless woman with nothing." She said it without self-pity, just as a statement of the arithmetic as it had existed then. The kind of person who doesn't get believed when she says something is wrong. Ronan's jaw tightened slightly. "You were right, and he was wrong, and he knew it and did it anyway." "Yes. And now there's a federal judge who also knows it." She looked at the letter again, at Colson's precise, careful handwriting laying out the fraud in terms that would hold up in a court of law. The weight of the last several months, the running, the fear, the Cheyenne window, the mountain in the dark, the nightmares, Granger's face in her father's house, and then again in this clearing, she felt all of it shift at once. Not disappear, but change character, the way a thing changed when you finally understood its actual shape. She'd spent months running from a lie. Not from her own weakness, not from some failure of courage or standing or worth. From a deliberate, calculated lie built by a man who had looked at her and seen someone he could push over. And she'd kept running until she hit a mountain, and the mountain had been, improbably, exactly the right place to stop. She put the letter carefully back in its envelope. "Thank you," she said to Ronan. "Colson did the work," he said. "You wrote the letter that asked him to." She met his eyes. "Don't minimize that." He held her gaze for a moment and then looked at the table, which was as close as he got to accepting a thing gracefully. Eli finished his coffee and set the cup down. "I'll head back down before the afternoon light goes," he said, "unless there's something else that needs doing." "There's nothing else?" Ronan said. "Tell Colson we're grateful." "I'll tell him." Eli moved toward the door. He paused, with his hand on the frame, and looked at the two of them at the table. At Ronan with his scarred hands and his closed, careful face, and at Delilah with the letter in front of her and something in her expression that had been reordering itself since she finished reading. "Place looks different than it did in January," he said. "Better different." Then he went out to his horse and rode back down the mountain. March moved toward April, in the slow, arguable way of high-elevation springs, where the snow pulled back from the southern exposures first, and the north sides of things stayed white, long after you wanted to be done with winter. The light changed before the temperature did, arriving earlier each morning, staying later each evening, a pale, watery brightness that didn't have the warmth to match it yet, but was undeniably there, undeniably more than it had been. Delilah noticed the light, the way she'd been noticing things since the Colson letter, with a clarity that had something to do with no longer bracing constantly for impact. When you stopped clenching against the next bad thing, you had room to actually see what was in front of you. What was in front of her was considerable. She and Ronan broke ground on the root cellar in the last week of March, on a day when the frost had gone deep enough in the past week that the ground was workable for the first time. He'd drawn a rough plan on paper the night before, and she'd looked at it and suggested moving the entry wall 6 feet east to take advantage of the natural slope, and he'd studied her change for about 30 seconds and then erased his original line and redrew it where she'd indicated, and that was how they made decisions, which was easily and without requiring anyone to win. The digging was hard. The soil was good, as he'd said, but there were rocks that had to be moved rather than dug around, and the first day they didn't get as far as she'd hoped, and the second day one of the support stakes cracked and had to be recut. And the third day it rained in a cold, miserable way that made outdoor work miserable, and they came inside early and sat by the fire with mud on their boots and drank coffee and didn't say much about it. "It'll take longer than I thought," she said. "Most things do," he said. "That doesn't bother you?" He looked at the fire. "I'm not going anywhere." She looked at the side of his face, at the way the firelight moved across it. "Neither am I," she said. "I want you to know that. Not as a plan, not as something I'm deciding based on circumstances. I want you to know it as a fact." He turned to look at her. "I know you didn't send for me," she said. "And I know this started as something practical, a place to be, a trade of work for shelter. I'm not asking you to make it into something it's not." She held his gaze steadily. "I'm just telling you that whatever this is, I'm not treating it as temporary. And if you need more time to decide what it is for you, that's all right. But I'm not going to pretend I don't know what's true." The fire crackled. Outside, the rain moved against the window glass in irregular tapping waves. "What's true?" he said. "That I have been happier in this cabin than I have been anywhere in my adult life," she said. "Not because it's easy. It isn't. Not because everything is settled and safe. It isn't that yet either. But because I'm exactly who I am here, and no one is asking me to be different, and the work I do matters, and the person I do it with." She stopped. "Sees me." Ronan was quiet for a moment. "I see you," he said. It wasn't performative. It was just true. Stated the way he stated true things, without decoration. "I know," she said. "That's what I'm talking about." He looked at the fire for a moment. Then he set his cup down and turned to face her fully, which he didn't often do in conversation. He usually carried some angle, some partial turn that left him a degree removed. He turned to face her the way he turned to face things he'd decided to stop managing the distance from. "I didn't send for a bride," he said. "You're right about that. But I've thought about who sent that letter. Thought about it for weeks." He paused. "Whoever wrote it described what I wanted more accurately than I ever had to myself. Capable, willing to work, someone who understood that life up here wasn't gentle." He looked at her. "I don't know if Westward Hearts got lucky, or if someone who knew me better than I thought did me a favor. But whoever wrote that letter was right." She absorbed that. "You're saying fate sent me up this mountain," she said, with a dryness that was almost a smile. "I'm saying whoever forged that letter did something good by accident," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way she'd learned to recognize as the closest he got to a grin. "I'm not calling it fate. That sounds like something on a greeting card." She did smile then, a real one. "What do you call it?" "Lucky," he said. "I call it lucky." She looked at him across the small distance of the firelit cabin, this man who had opened a door in January, not because he owed her anything, but because he'd seen a bruise on her wrist and understood what it meant, who had written letters on her behalf without telling her, who had stood in a clearing and told Granger that no debt made a woman property, who had spent 4 years punishing himself for an accident by living small and alone, and had been interrupted in that punishment by a woman climbing a mountain in the dark with everything she owned on her back. "Lucky," she agreed. Cal's letter came in early April, carried up by Eli with a look on his face that suggested he knew what it was and had been cautious with it. Ronan read it at the table after dinner, and Delilah did the dishes with her back to him and made enough ordinary noise to give him the privacy of the moment without leaving the room entirely, because leaving felt wrong. She heard him put the letter down. She turned around. His expression was doing several things at once in a way that his expression rarely did. He was usually very contained, very single-noted. Right now, he looked like a man who had just set down something he'd been carrying so long that the absence of the weight was almost disorienting. "He wrote back," she said. "He wrote back." "What did he say?" Ronan looked at the letter on the table. "He said he's been waiting 3 years for me to stop being an idiot." A pause. His words. She set down the cloth she was holding. That sounds like a man who forgave you a while ago. Yeah. He cleared his throat. He says... He stopped. Tried again. He says he learned to rope left-handed. Says he's actually better at it now than he was before. She didn't say anything for a moment. She understood what that cost him to hear. Not just the relief of it, but the specific weight of realizing that the person you hurt found a way through it while you were busy being wrecked by guilt. That life went on in your absence and didn't wait for you to finish punishing yourself before it continued. He sounds like a good man, she said. Better than me, Ronan said. Always was. That's not the standard. She came to the table and sat down. The standard isn't whether someone is better than you. The standard is whether you show up when it matters. She looked at him. You showed up, late, but you showed up. He looked at the letter. He wants me to come down in the summer. Bring... He stopped. He said, bring whoever you want to bring. He said I seemed like I might have someone worth bringing. She looked at him steadily. How would he know that? I may have mentioned it in my letter. You mentioned me. I mentioned... He paused. I mentioned that the situation up here had changed, that I had reason to think about the summer differently than I had in previous years. She absorbed that, the careful, oblique language of a man who was feeling something significant and had mentioned it in writing to his brother before he said it plainly to her face. Somehow that made it more true, not less. The things you said to someone else before you could say them to the person were the things you were most certain about. I'd like to meet him, she said. Yeah? Something in Ronan's expression opened slightly. A man who waits 3 years for his brother to stop being an idiot and then calls it like that when he writes back? She raised an eyebrow. Yes, I'd like to meet him. The corner of Ronan's mouth moved. He picked up the letter and folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket, close to him, and she noted that and filed it with the other things she knew about who he was. Spring came to the Bitterroot Mountains the way it always did. Not in a single arrival, but in arguments. 3 warm days followed by a hard freeze. Snow that melted by midday and refroze by midnight. The creek below the cabin woke up noisily before the snowpack above it was ready. And there was a week of meltwater flooding the lower path that meant routing around it until the ground settled. She didn't mind the mess of it. She'd always found the argument of spring more honest than the finished fact of summer, more interesting, more alive, more reflective of how things actually worked, which was imperfectly and with setbacks, and not according to any schedule that was convenient for the people involved. One morning in late April, she was on the upper flat, marking the position of the cattle fence they'd agreed to build along the southern edge, driving stakes at measured intervals into ground that was finally soft enough to accept them. The work was satisfying in a specific way, not just because it was useful, but because it was future-oriented in a way that most work wasn't. A fence was an argument that something was going to be here long enough to need containing. Ronan came up through the pines and watched her drive the last stake for a moment before he spoke. You're 6 inches east of the line we marked, he said. She looked at the stake, looked at the previous one. No, I'm not. 6 inches. Then the line we marked was wrong. She looked at him. The grade changes right where I am. If we run the fence on your line, we're posting on a slope and the tension on the north wire will be off. He walked the distance between the last 2 stakes and looked at the ground, crouched and looked at it more carefully. Stood up. You're right, he said. I know, she said, and handed him a stake to carry. They walked the rest of the fence line together, adjusting where the ground told them to adjust, arguing twice more about specific positions, and resolving it both times by looking at the actual ground rather than the map, which was how most of their arguments resolved. Not by one person winning, but by the facts of the thing being allowed to settle the question. She thought, driving the last stake into the April ground with the mountains all around her and the light finally warm enough that she'd pushed her coat sleeves back, that this was what she would tell someone, if someone asked her what she'd learned from the last several months. Not that strength was about being fearless. She'd been afraid consistently, badly, and fear hadn't disqualified her from any of it. Not that the right person would fix what was broken in you. Ronan hadn't fixed her, and she hadn't fixed him. They were both still carrying their things, still navigating the specific damage of their specific histories. What they'd done was make the carrying less isolated, made it something done in company rather than alone. Not that worth was something you earned by being small enough or accommodating enough or pleasing enough to whoever was doing the measuring. She'd spent years believing that her size, her plainness, her circumstance made her someone who needed to work twice as hard for half the consideration. Granger had tried to use that belief against her, had counted on her having so little faith in her own standing that a forged document in a confident manner would be enough to make her compliant. He'd been wrong about her. She had been wrong about herself. Those two wrongnesses had lived alongside each other for a long time, and it had taken a mountain and a cold-eyed, careful man and a federal fraud investigation to sort them out. What she knew now, not as an idea, but as something she'd earned in specific, hard-won increments, was that worth wasn't assigned. It wasn't given by the approval of people who had decided to withhold it. It was demonstrated, stubbornly, in the daily act of continuing to be exactly who you were in the face of every pressure to be less. She drove the last stake and stood up straight and looked out across the flat to the peaks beyond, which were still half white in late April, but had begun to show the gray rock of their higher faces again. Winter pulling back from them inch by inch, the way it pulled back from everything. Ronan came to stand beside her. "That's the line," he said. "That's the line," she agreed. They stood there for a moment, looking at the row of stakes crossing the upper flat, at the shape of what was going to be there. Not there yet, but defined, committed to. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the stakes, not at her, and his hands were in his coat pockets, and his jaw was set in the way it was when he was making himself say a thing he'd already decided to say, rather than continuing to not say it. "I know we haven't talked about it directly," he said, "and I know how it started, which was not what either of us planned. And I know you're not someone who needs asking. You're not someone who needs permission to stay or to go or to decide anything about your own life." He paused. "But I'd like to ask anyway, because it matters to me and I want it to be something we chose, not just something that happened by default." She waited. He looked at her then, fully, directly, with none of the managed distance. "Will you stay?" he asked. "Not because you have nowhere else to be. Not because it's practical, because you want to be here." The mountain was very quiet around them. The April wind moved through the pines below the flat in that long, clean way that smelled of snowmelt and pine resin and the specific mineral sharpness of altitude. "Yes," she said. "That's the answer." "Just yes?" "What else do you need?" He thought about it. "Nothing," he said. "Just wanted to make sure it was a yes." "It's a yes," she said. "Ronan, it's been a yes for a while." He nodded once, slowly, and looked back at the stakes marking the fence line on the upper flat of 60 acres that was going to have a root cellar in the northwest corner and cattle wintering in the south section, and probably other things neither of them had fully planned yet because the future had a way of requiring things that the present couldn't entirely anticipate. He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, just put his hand around hers, warm and rough and certain, and held it. She let him. They stood like that on the mountain, in the flat light of an April morning that was finally, provisionally warm, and looked at the stakes in the ground and the work still to be done, and the mountains holding them in from every direction, and neither of them said anything more because there wasn't anything more that needed saying. What had been broken in them was not fully healed. People who had been through what they'd each been through didn't come out the other side fully mended. They came out changed, carrying things differently, understanding their own weight better than they had. Ronan still thought about Cal every time he looked at his brother's letter. Delilah still woke some mornings with the echo of Cheyenne in her chest, still felt the old reflex of making herself smaller when she moved through a new space, still had moments when the cruelty of what Granger had tried to do rose up fresh and made her angry in a way that had nowhere comfortable to go. But they were both still standing, still working, still building something on 60 acres of mountain ground that a year ago neither of them had imagined would have anything on it. That was the truth of it. Not the clean version, not the version where everything resolved into simplicity and the wounds became invisible. The real version, where two people who had been badly handled by life found each other on a mountain and made something imperfect and solid and honest, and chose it deliberately and kept choosing it, and understood that the choosing was the thing. Travelers who came through Harlan's Creek that summer, on their way north or west or up into the territory, heard about the homestead in the Bitterroot Range. Not as a remarkable thing, just as information, the way people passed along the locations of reliable water and passable trails. A mountain man up the south approach, they said, the one with the well-kept cabin and the upper flat under cultivation. His wife was the one who'd fixed the Callaway barn roof when it collapsed in the spring floods, who'd shown the Hendricks family how to pack their larder for a second winter, who'd sat with old Margaret Callaway through a bad spell of sickness without being asked. Some people, in the way of small communities that noticed things, remarked on her. A big woman, they said, strong, plain-spoken, the kind who looked you in the eye and meant what she told you. They said it the way you said something you respected. They said she and the mountain man were well matched. They were not wrong. Eli Hartwell, who had known Ronan Mercer for 4 years and had watched the whole of it from his particular vantage point at the trading post in Harlan's Creek, said only this when people asked him about it. He needed someone who could handle the mountain. She needed somewhere the mountain would hold. Nobody asked what that meant exactly. Most people, if they sat with it long enough, figured it out.